안녕하십니까. 저는 건국대학교 행정학과 이용모라고 합니다. Well, I would like to welcome all of you to this special lecture. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's invited speaker, Dr. Chris Weible from the University of Colorado at Denver. Dr. Weible is currently an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado. He received his PhD in ecology from the University of California at Davis after getting his master's in public administration and a bachelor's degree in mathematics and statistics from the University of Washington. Dr. Weible has also been the editor for the Policy Studies Journal since 2008. He recently co-edited the third edition of Theories of the Policy Process with the late Paul Sabatier. His research focuses on studying multi-stakeholder collaboration processes in aquaculture partnerships, assessing policy designs and improving outcomes in organic farming, climate change politics, and analyzing the politics of unconventional oil and gas development using hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Well, today he will give us a talk on an overview of the Advocacy Coalition Framework, past, present, and future. So please welcome Dr. Chris Weible with a round of applause.
And welcome everybody to this talk. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to give an overview of the Advocacy Coalition Framework, which I'll term as the ACF from here on out. I will talk about the past, where it's been, how it was created, where it is right now, the present, and a little bit about the future, which I hope some of you will be a part of. Before I begin, I would like to spend just a moment talking about the research lab that I co-direct. It's called the Workshop on Policy Process Research, or the WOPR. You can find us online, just Google WOPR. I co-direct this with Tanya Heikkila, who's the third woman from the left. She actually, whereas I worked with Paul Sabatier as a graduate student, she worked with Len Ostrom and Della Schlager as a graduate student. And so combined, we have a research lab that has a strong foundation in policy process research. We do work on environmental conflicts and issues of environmental cooperation. Our work is both practical and theoretical, meaning we work with decision makers, especially in Colorado. And yet we also spend a lot of our time working to influence academia. And perhaps most importantly for this crowd, we warmly welcome visiting scholars and students. So if you're interested in coming, please let us know. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the ACF, and I'm going to begin with this distinction, which I think is probably one of the most important distinctions that we need to make in order to understand the ACF today. And that is this distinction between frameworks and theory. This distinction, by the way, goes back in the United States, at least to David Easton and his work in the 50s and 60s. More recently, it has come out of the Eleanor Ostrom tradition in her workshop in Indiana University. The purpose of a framework is really to provide the scope of your research, the general set of questions that a framework is intended to help answer. It provides a set of assumptions so researchers can kind of assume some things are given in the world, because we can't always argue about all the foundational components of our research. It establishes general categories and concepts for study and relates those in a very general way, often like in a flow diagram. and it can support one or more theories. And so sometimes we use the word theory very generically. When used in this distinction, it's used very precisely. In that regard, a theory has a very narrow scope, a narrower scope than a framework. It relates concepts, usually in some sort of like an hypothesis or proposition, sometimes in the form of principles. It provides a set of causal mechanisms, often about why two variables may relate. What's the source of their relationship? And provides contextual nuances. For example, you may have a theory about how a certain policy process perhaps might work in Korea, or might have one of how the policy process might work in China, but that might operate underneath the same framework. And so as we can imagine, as we start going more and more comparative, more and more global in policy process research, the study of public policy, we need a framework theory distinction, because the framework provides that foundation for a lot of scholars to have a very similar vocabulary, but it provides the freedom to develop specificities per the context. So we can capture the differences in South Korea's government as compared to the US government. In the ACF, this is a very general setup. It's not always this way, but basically the framework has certain assumptions, scope, and I'll talk about these basic concepts, general associations. And the ACF can be thought of as supporting, in general, three areas of emphasis, theoretical emphasis. Coalitions, learning, and policy change are the three major areas that this framework has supported for years. And it has hypotheses that operate within each of these boxes within this framework. It can have more. This is not exclusive. This is not everything that it has. But this is the general area that has its strengths. In terms of its assumption, I'm just going to go through some of the basic kind of foundational aspects of it as a framework. These are aspects that are typically stable. We want to be stable over time, so researchers know that this is the general setup that it offers and provides. It all starts with the policy subsystem. In any government system, there's decisions and non-decisions, and many of these decisions fall within a particular policy subsystem, a topical area. It could be welfare, it could be national security, aviation, telecommunications. It can have a territory, the entire country of South Korea, or it can be localized into a local community, possibly. Within each subsystem, there's specialists. These specialists can come from government, they can come from the private sector, businesses, nonprofits, academia, the news media, really anybody who's involved in that subsystem trying to influence its affairs. You can imagine, in some countries, the structure of a policy subsystem will differ based on the government system within which it is set. So you might imagine that subsystems in South Korea will be structured differently than the subsystems in the US. You might have, for example, a higher likelihood of centralized subsystems in South Korea, because you don't have as decentralized as a governing system as we have in the United States. The policy actors might differ also. You might not have as many, let's say, nonprofit advocates in South Korea as you might have in the United States. You might not have as many, I don't know, perhaps scientists. I don't know how active scientists are in the political process in South Korea. That's an empirical question. The model of the individual. We assume it's boundly rational. We assume the importance of a belief system, and we could talk a lot about belief systems. I don't have it on my slides here, but basically it assumes that we're guided by these normative views of the world and empirical views of the world that structure how we think about things and what we care about. And also a concept called the devil shift. And this devil shift concept is basically the tendency for us to demonize our opponents. In high conflict situations, sometimes we can remember losses or defeats more than our victories. And we tend to demonize the people that we argue with, that we fight against. And that's one of the sources of coalition politics, the polarization of people in political debates and why it lasts so long, because we have a difficult time negotiating, talking with people that we've demonized. Policy and programs are the translations of beliefs, and that's one of the reasons why people fight over policies, because it's a reflection of what they care about. And also one of the reasons why we need to look at policies from a long-term time perspective, because our values don't change that often. So one side may win a policy dispute, but the other side, their beliefs are still there, and they may win the next battle. They may change that policy in the future. It also assumes the importance of scientific and technical information, in part because our belief systems, we need to put together causes and effects. And sometimes we just do it implicitly based on our experience, our professional experience. But oftentimes we use science to kind of connect the dots and make causal arguments about problem severity, problem causes, and hence policy solutions. And again, the long-term time perspective. Like I said, sometimes policies can be adopted in this time period, and they could be turned down or changed in the next time period. And if we want to understand why a particular policy was adopted today, we often have to look at events many years ago. Now, these are some general assumptions. Sometimes it's okay to take a shorter term time perspective, depending on your research question. Nothing wrong with that. But this is the general assumptions that the framework is based on. They're the norms, they're not strict rules. The scope. This framework is most applicable to high conflict, contentious policy issues, the subsystem level, especially if you're interested in questions of coalitions, learning, and policy change. Yet at the same time, people apply this framework outside of this scope all the time. Not all the time, well, frequently, I would say. And for example, some people apply it to understand organizational level of analysis and not policy subsystems. Some people analyze very low contentious issues, where there's maybe one coalition. And from my perspective, that's okay. You just have to be careful in how that's done. And I really like this quote by Herbert Simon in his book, Science of the Artificial. And he views essentially all human artifacts as working best in a particular environment, like a benign environment. And we can imagine policy theories the same way. They were created, like the ACF, in a pluralistic system of the US. They were created to understand high conflict situations. Sometimes it's good to apply it outside of that context, because then we'll understand what's strong about that theory or framework, and we can also understand what's weak about it, what's limiting it. And that's one of the ways we learn. Some of you may have seen this. This is the basic setup of a policy subsystem. The idea is that you may have two coalitions. Sometimes you have one. Sometimes you have more than two. Coalitions have members. They have beliefs, resources. They strategize over long periods of time. They try to affect government decisions. They try to shape the institutions that govern our society through policy outputs and impacts. Policy subsystems are set within a broader context. And this context in a more complicated flow diagram looks like this, where we have relatively stable parameters up in the left upper corner, more dynamic external events down in the left corner, and some intermediate variables in the middle that intervene between the stable parameters and the external subsystem events in the subsystem. Sometimes the relatively stable parameters are not that stable. That's fine. In South Korea in particular, one of the reasons I find it so fascinating historically is how rapid the change has been in the last 30 years. And so those relatively stable parameters may be very stable in the United States, but they're less stable here. Sometimes changes in external subsystem events may not matter in subsystem, and some subsystems, but matter in others. I would argue, at least in the South Korean context, because many subsystems on some topics are very centralized, that elections matter probably more here in general than in the United States. Because we can have a new president, and I would put money on it, that most policy subsystems in Colorado wouldn't change at all. It's so distant. Here, less so. Of course, there's exceptions to that. This is just a framework depiction. There's nothing causally related here. It just shows general relationships. We talked about the general theories within this framework. These are some of the kind of theoretical arguments that have at least been confirmed in some contexts. We know that actors form coalitions in contentious issues. This was actually debated when this framework was first put together. People did not think this was the case. These coalitions can be stable, but they're not stable all the time. In fact, it varies by context. Sometimes a coalition will emerge and stick around until the job is done, until the policy is changed, or they stop the policy from happening. And then it disbands. Other times the coalitions can last for decades. It matters by topic. Often there's defections, especially if a coalition includes members that are political appointees. And those members will flip as the political parties shift in power. Learning occurs mostly within a coalition, and less likely between coalitions, because we tend to learn from our friends, and we don't like to learn from our opponents. And there are several paths to change. External shocks to the subsystem, maybe a nuclear disaster in Japan might affect nuclear power policy here in South Korea. Internal shocks. The MERS epidemic virus right now could be an internal shock for the health system in this country. Internal shocks are different than external shocks. Internal shocks, especially I would argue, in South Korea, because it is a little more centralized in the US, you can place blame a whole lot easier in internal shocks, because you assume that it's the policies, it's the rules in this country or the behavior that caused that internal shock, that failure. You can't do that with an external shock. You can't blame anybody, well, I don't know if you can, anybody in this country about what happened with the nuclear disaster in Japan several years ago. But internal shocks, well, we can blame people very easily. Learning and negotiated agreements are other paths to change. Sometimes it's some sort of combination. It's a shock, it's learning, and negotiations. It's not just one. Sometimes these events occur over time. They cascade. They build onto each other. Also, changes in a governing coalition, often through elections, can have a huge impact on policy subsystems and change. There's hypotheses structured around these general theoretical arguments, and I've actually the hypotheses on some backup slides. I can talk about these more, but I'm going to move on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the past of this framework, because you might get more insights about what it's like today from its past. I'm going to start off just by saying that it was created by Paul Sabatier in 1981 and 82. He spent a summer, or actually an entire year, on sabbatical at the University of Bielefeld, Germany. Well, back then it was the German Federal Republic. At the time, Lynn Ostrom was there, and Vincent Ostrom was there. Benny Hearn, who was one of the implementation scholars, a bottom-up implementation scholar, was there. Paul at the time, Sabatier at the time, had already established himself as a scholar with Dan Nasmanian with their implementation framework. The debates at the time was, how do you deal with this bottom-up and top-down debate about implementation? The Ostroms had just created the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. And so when Paul was trying to figure out, how can we study, how can we understand this constant tinkering of policies, he looked at implementation and he knew it just wasn't, you adopt a policy, you implement it. You adopt a policy, you implement it, but then there's this constant tinkering and change that goes on over time. And he wanted to capture that in a framework or in a theory. He didn't know how to call it at the time. But working, especially, that's one of the reasons why it was good to work with Len Ostrom, because the IAD framework came in handy in terms of how to structure the ACF. Paul wrote the first version of the ACF called the Strategic Interaction Theory of Policy Evolution and Learning. Policy evolution as a term was dropped from the ACF kind of lexicon. And actually, it's kind of funny. It's actually a note from Lynn Ostrom. She said, drop the term evolution, too much baggage. And he called it instead policy change. But that evolution, this constant tinkering, was part of the idea. That actually policy change doesn't really quite capture. Evolution suggests something ongoing. Policy change suggests a change, a single change. So it is different imagery. But that was the intent. He submitted a special issue to Policy Sciences, a journal. And in fact, I think Peter de Leon was here a couple years ago. Peter and Paul were good friends, and Peter's a very dear friend of mine. And he was the editor at the time. And he was very supportive of the special issue. And actually it was a special issue with like a collection of 5 or 6 applications of the ACF. Peter was a strong supporter of this, but then Peter stepped down as an editor. And this other person, which I won't mention, came on as an editor and actually rejected it. And this was the letter that Paul got, part of the letter. And I edit the Policy Studies Journal, and I think I've probably dealt with maybe 5,000, 6,000 reviews, peer reviews. I don't think I've ever seen one this blatantly just mean as this, where it ends with the problems with this paper are legion. This is about as bad as it gets in review. Maybe someone in here got a worse review than this, but this is pretty bad. He then got rejected by JPAN and also AJPS. Richard Bark, by the way, who along the way Paul met Hank Jenkins Smith. And Richard Bark is a classmate of Hank Jenkins Smith. And Richard Bark actually applied the ACF in a case study on hazardous waste policy in 1985 and got it published. So there's actually an application of the ACF before the framework was even published. And you also got to realize some people want to create a new theory. They want to create a new framework or something. So 4 years after he started doing this in 1981, it was still being rejected. 4 years. That's a long time. Thinking about how much time you can put into your work and how long it takes to get published. 4 years is a long time. Anyway, it finally got accepted and they had a wave of publications. It went back to Policy Sciences. In fact, the editor who rejected it before with that letter, that person stepped down and a new editor stepped up. And actually Paul decided to try it again and got published. And then Hank Jenkins Smith published his book on democratic politics and policy analysis, and the edited volume that really established it came out in '93. Since that time period, he had a lot of growth, especially outside the United States. I did this in 2006, and I honestly, I missed quite a few. For example, I know there's the first one, I believe, in South Korea happened in 2002, and it's not on this graph. But in 2006, there was about 80 applications that I had found, and I missed a few, like I said. And over time, they slowly kind of spread around the globe. Topically, they also started in the environmental area, and soon also started to diversify a little bit more. And over this same time period, I'm not going to go through all these points, but there's huge debate. In fact, I would say with every theory that came out of the United States, punctuated equilibrium, the ACF, multiple streams. Back in the late 90s, the debate was, are these applicable in Europe? Because it doesn't have the pluralistic federal structure of the United States. And so Paul wrote a very important paper called Revisions and Relevance for Europe, for the ACF, and this was really important in getting the framework applied in Europe, and now it's applied in Europe more so than the United States. Also, I think it's, from what I'm getting, applied in South Korea more so than in the United States. I won't go through too much of these points, it's pretty self-evident, but I will say that there's several special issues that came out the last few years. One, Administration and Society on the ACF applied in the Asian context, and the other one in Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis that I was a part of about the ACF applied outside of Western Europe and the North American context. In particular, we have applications in China, India, the Philippines, and Kenya. I should have had one in South Korea, but I did not. And in 2014, I tried to count, again, this is all, in fact, it's mislabeled, all English applications written in English. I found 224. You can see that most now, there's 94 total applications in Europe, 95 in the US, about the same percentage. But most of those have occurred recently. Also, it's getting more diverse, topically still dominated by the environment, but more and more health, social issues, technology, tourism. It's beyond what I understood. In fact, when I wrote the latest update of this framework in 2014, I thought I had a good grip on how people were applying the ACF. And I realized when I made this tally that I really don't. That there's so many people applying it that I just didn't know that people were supporting the hypotheses, confirming those hypotheses, or rejecting them, how they were applying it, the methods they were using. I just didn't know. And this is one of the reasons why I'm very glad to be here today. But I could say this, plenty of efforts were going on. And this was very exciting. And so, what we're seeing today is various assessments. We didn't know whether or not it's working or not. It might not be. Are these hypotheses being refuted? And so John Pierce, who's a former student of mine, he's now at Seattle University, he's actually coding all 300 English written applications. Daniel Norstedt and Kristen Olofsson are doing English and the Swedish ones in Sweden. We have people doing similar analyses in Germany. One of my students is doing analysis in China, and the 30 applications there. And Sojin Jang, who's from here, Kyungdong Park, are two Korean students I work with. We're coding all 67 applications in Korea, both in the Korean language and in the English language. Again, the point is, what's working and what's not. And this framework, we have to assess, has it outlived its usefulness? And if it is useful still, how can we improve it even more? In terms of what we're finding, so, Sojin and Kyungdong Park, they finished this coding literally last week. And so I'm not prepared to go into depth about what they found in their analysis. But there's 62 Korean applications that we found. These are peer-reviewed publications, not books, not dissertations, not master's theses. 5 in English. Most of these started to occur after 2009. The first one being in 2002. Topically, more diverse here than globally. If you might recall, most applications, about half, are in the environment. Here in South Korea, a lot of the applications are in social policy, development policy, and a splattering of others. Reasons for applying, very similar distribution you'll find anywhere. Most people apply the framework to understand coalitions and some sort of policy change. Learning is less of an emphasis. In fact, I would argue that learning is probably one of the most understudied areas of the framework and probably the most elusive. It's funny, in part because the framework was originally intended to understand learning, which is part of that ongoing tinkering, the ongoing evolution of policy over time. Learning was supposedly a big part of that, and it is. We've learned over time, which isn't really much to say, we just learned how complicated it is to study learning, or even document it, measure it. In terms of the strengths, a lot of people will say, at least this is what we're finding in the publication, that yeah, it helps explain things like policy change, coalition interactions. And it's better than the policy cycle, the state is heuristic, which is kind of, I guess, a compliment. In terms of the weaknesses, inapplicable or less applicable to less pluralistic societies like South Korea. And then there's 2 or 3 others. I highlight the red one because that's, I think, really relevant. I do think 2, 3, and 4 are relevant, but I will tell you, US scholars will say the same thing. They'll say 2, 3, and 4 are problems with the framework, and actually I agree. The first one is the question to ask. You know, how applicable is it here? I would argue it is applicable, otherwise people would not be using it. However, it needs to be applied in a very careful way, in a way that captures the nuances and the specificity of the South Korean context, while at the same time not totally altering the framework as that basis. And this is where the framework theory distinction comes into use. And I'll talk about this here in a second as we talk about the future. What's up next? Well, first off, there's this really just a global scale application of the ACF that really has never been seen before. And I would say the same thing about policy process research. It's more global today than it ever has been. And this is really exciting. It's more comparative than it ever has been. But this also provides an opportunity and also a challenge for anyone and everyone who's interested in studying public policy, because we need to figure out how we can basically generate that knowledge that respects and identifies the specificity of the context, but yet also draws the general lessons. So how do we do this? Well, first off, we can create deliberative comparative research projects. I'm very proud. I was in Zurich this past February, and we had a 7-country comparison applying the ACF on the topic of oil and gas development. All 7 studies applied the ACF, all 7 studies answered the same questions in different contexts, and I think I learned more about the framework and more about the strengths and the weaknesses from that workshop than I ever have in any other experience that I've been a part of. We need to develop common methods, but not strict methods, of data collection and analysis. This is really important. This is where it gets into, again, balancing the specifics and the generalities. The problem is this: when I was looking at applications, I see people refuting hypotheses or supporting hypotheses. What I don't know is whether or not their finding is contingent upon the method they're using or the context within which they're studying. Because if everybody's using different methods, you might come up with slightly different results. And it's especially bad if I can't tell the method of data collection that was used or how it was analyzed. So if people are interpreting, let's say, a certain type of belief, a secondary belief versus a policy belief differently across contexts, we won't learn anything at all. This is really problematic. Again, we don't want strict rules. We just want best practices. We just want general guidelines that can be adapted to a certain context, but can enable at least communication and for people to do these assessments, to build up that knowledge and learn what's working and what's not working over time. And finally, excuse me about the abbreviation. ICPP is basically the International Conference on Public Policy. If anybody from in this room is going to go to Milan, let me know. We will be having a meeting about pushing forward basically a common research agenda on the ACF using common methods of data collection. And finally, I think to move forward is to think this framework theory distinction. Maybe create country-specific hypotheses or expectations that are unique to the South Korean context. Then we can also compare and contrast with what's working in, Sweden to Switzerland to the United States. But you also have that common framework, so we can still learn from each other that foundation, which the ACF can provide. And finally, to what end? Assume all this works. Assume we have this great comparative agenda. Assume we have all these great applications. So what? At the end of the day, why does it matter? This is a question I think sometimes, especially when we think about policy theory, we forget the practical element and the obligation we have as scholars to contribute to society. And somewhere along the line, we need to start thinking about how the ACF can be a tool that can be used in that regard, which it typically has not been to this time, at this period of time. How this happens, I'm not entirely sure, but that's where we need to go. And at that, I thank you, and I look forward to our discussions.
Okay, thank you. Now, I would like to open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. So if you have anything, then please raise your hand. Before you ask any questions, would you tell me about what you are doing, who you are?
So, can I just speak with you, okay? So my name is Park Hyung-gu. I'm from Korea University, study PA, same field. And then I have one question about the history about like Sabatier's innocent theory, first state. So you just mentioned like it's in 91, 92, 81, 82 until like in the 84, he rejected like it's 4 times, right? And then suddenly like just accepted like by the journal like it's 96. Anything like it happened like why they just 4 years in a row? Then I just wondering.
So just to go back, so you're referring to the string of rejections and how it eventually got accepted.
Right.
Good question. First off, the framework, I mean, once you understand the sources of it, you understand like the IID framework and you can read the initial description of that. You read Hecklow's work, which Paul was exposed to in 81, 82. You really start looking at his lessons from the implementation literature. You can see how the ACF came together almost like an amalgamation of all these different pieces. But this general idea that these coalitions would be stable in a subsystem was resoundingly rejected by a lot of the reviewers. They just didn't think it was possible. They didn't think it was there. And Paul saw it in his case studies at the time in California. But I think Paul probably overstated the extent that that always was the case, or put bounds on how stable those coalitions were. But what happened in 1984, I will say, is that he started to collect data. That's where Hank Chicken-Smith really came in handy. They actually started to collect data, not just on survey data, which he did in the Lake Tahoe region in California in 1984, but they also started to code legislative hearings to track belief change over time and the stability of coalitions over time. And they had data to back up what they were saying. Ironically, the 86 papers did not include data, but the special issue did have some data in it. But what happened also, I think over time, they presented the same framework at many conferences, and that's how the Richard Bark publication happened. People were seeing this applied. Ken Meyer, some of you might know, cites also the ACF in his book on bureaucracy, and I think in 1984 even. So people knew about it. A lot of people knew about it. And so I think when the referees were reviewing it in 86 and 87, they're like, oh yeah, I've seen this applied so many times. I think they just kind of gave in, because I think they accepted it as something that was legitimate. That was not the case originally. I think it was almost too new. At least that's my interpretation. I will tell you that if you were to read the very first one, Notes Toward a Strategic Interaction Theory of Policy Evolution and Learning, the structure of that paper is essentially the same as in 88. So the theory, the framework itself did not change much over that time period at all.
Any other questions? Then I'll have one question about your presentation. I saw that there are more application of ACF in the field of environment than the others, right? Is there any specific reason why the environment has heavily used this kind of framework?
Right. Well, I think that's a good question, and we could probably each have an answer. My sense is that environmental issues are often zero-sum games. Meaning, I want to use this piece of land for one reason, and somebody else wants to use it for another reason. I want to build a dam, or I want to use the river for rafting, or for fishing, or protect the environment. And so it's very hard oftentimes to find common ground when what you're fighting about is not easily shared. But also I would say, Paul Sabatier and Hank Jenkins-Smith both studied environmental issues and energy issues. And so therefore there's a legacy of that with who their friends are, you know, what panels they presented on at conferences, how the framework kind of moved through the network of people that wanted to apply it. I think that definitely, especially in the early years, had a huge influence on where it was applied. I'd also say third, you know, I edit the Policy Studies Journal, and it's basically a journal that's dedicated towards advancing theory. And I think about 40%, 30% of all submissions and publications are in the environmental area. So I think it's also very common for scholars to do environmental issues to focus on a theoretical perspective. Whereas sometimes the scholars that say we do education policy often focus more on evaluation of that data because they have great outcomes. They don't focus on the conflict as much. So part is just the tradition or the pattern of what scholars do. And I think the ACF is just part of it. I don't think there's anything about the ACF that makes it, especially anything about, let's say, poverty to education to health. All those issues could be analyzed by the ACF. There's nothing about them that says they can't be. It's just who the scholars are.
Professor Moon.
Jay Moon.
Oh, hi, Dr. Moon, how are you?
Very good. I have just a very quick question. While ACF has been appreciated by many people, and they really appreciate the utility and benefit of the framework for particularly policy process. At the same time, a lot of people say it's too comprehensive, it can be applied to any policy issues. And it's a combination of issue network, policy communities, interest group politics. So that, how do you see those critiques or critical perspective raised by several people?
Just to back up a little bit, I have a lot of concerns about the framework, and I think there's reasons why we should consider not using it anymore. That's not one of them. Yeah, it does kind of bring in a lot of, it's very comprehensive in its structure. And especially if I were to kind of back up, if people were to actually take this flow chart seriously, it can be very daunting to try to apply it. That's also why I think if a person were to analyze and read a lot of applications, most of this flow diagram is not actually studied. They zoom in on a particular subcomponent of it, and they don't look at all the components together at the same time. Some people will. I will say, for me, for example, and the work I did as a young scholar, still a young scholar, and as a PhD student, I really focused up here. In fact, I don't think I looked at any government decisions. I used network analysis to understand the structure of coalitions. In fact, I didn't really realize, I kind of knew that, but it really didn't dawn on me that the ACF is known for as a study of policy change. And then I realized after applying for 10 years, I was like, wow, I've never actually applied it to study policy change. I've only applied it to study the structure of coalitions and how those coalitions change over time. And then I started looking at, some people really look at policy change, and coalitions are almost like the means to an end. They don't spend a lot of time talking about the network structure of coalitions. They don't really care. They want to explain policy change. And so some people, I think, don't take that too seriously. And they pick and choose what they want, they pick up the tool, and they apply it in a way that's pragmatic and that works for them. And I think that's probably the best way to go. If I had a book project, I would try to tackle everything. But I don't think in an article it's very easily done, although people do it all the time too. But if you do that, you have to take a broad brush stroke, very broad perspective, and apply it in different ways. So yeah, I mean, it does kind of bring up in a lot of areas, but also say the world's complex, and some of our tools are complex tools, and some of our tools are not complex tools. And you know, my PhD is actually in ecology, and I had a friend, a colleague who used to study genetics in a petri dish, and she would spend 6 months trying to get the petri dish all set up perfectly, and then it would fail, and she'd be crying because it was like 6 months wasted, right? Because it took her so long to learn this tool. In the social sciences, we almost assume our tools should be applicable and used and learned in 1 day or 2 days. And I think that's kind of limiting. We almost like limit the fact that what we're studying is complex soups and hard to deal with. And I think we should almost embrace the complexity of our tools because the world is complex. I think I turned off the computer again. It's coming back on. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Moon. It's a pleasure meeting you.
Hey, any other comments or questions?
One more question.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I was a student in this university, I read many articles and ACF applications. So there are some ACF applications is connected with the other theories or the other frameworks. So how do you think about this phenomenon in the research, especially, for example, some researcher used some part of the ACF RX subsystem or correlation A or B conflict, some confliction between correlations and cross use the other framework for example network analysis or the other framework. So how do you think about it?
A couple things. And in fact, I'm kind of of two minds on this. And so what I'll say may come across as contradictory. So I'll try, well, it will be contradictory, but there'll be a few caveats in that. First off, I do believe that the ACF is best thought of as a framework, and it can support theories underneath it, multiple theories. In that regard, I'm very pragmatic in my orientation. And if I have a problem that I'm trying to solve, and I'm using the ACF, and a lot of people will ask me, well, ACF is all about beliefs, why don't you study interests? Or what happens if I want to study interests? I'm like, well, fine, study interests. I mean, there's nothing stopping a person from looking at the interests of individuals, how they form coalitions. And Paul Sabatier thought that interests were part of a belief system anyway, so that works. But if you want to study them independently of a belief system, do it. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. And in fact, you want to do that. You want valid explanations. And using a framework and putting it in the framework as blinders that can prevent a good explanation of your phenomenon because you're only applying a single framework, I think is very limiting in terms of that perspective. That said, some frameworks and theories are more compatible to others, and some are not. For example, Hank Jacob Smith applies cultural theory quite a bit, and he's a big fan of using cultural theory as a way of measuring deep core beliefs within the ACF. It's a great fit within the framework. I had a PhD student last year who looked at policy analytical capacity, basically resources within a community for processing and using information. Use it within the framework. Fit great. Other theories don't. I mean, policy network analysis, from my perspective, isn't really a theory; it's a method. And I've been doing that for a long time, so I don't see that as like incompatible either. I think it's just part of the framework. It's always been there. As soon as the network analysis kind of picked up as a technique, this is brought in. A lot of people in Korea use it in conjunction with multiple streams. That's where it starts getting a little more complicated because multiple streams has its own integrity within that particular theory. And the challenge with merging theories is that you don't want to treat any one theory on the surface level. And this is where I get into little bit more contradictory. If you want to merge, make sure you know the theories and the depth within those theories, and don't treat them as a very simplified structure. And I get a little more worried with multiple streams because there's depth there that I don't completely understand. And I really get worried about when I see the ACF applied with Ostrom's IAD framework. I've been really trying to understand the IAD framework for 6 years. And I've hung out with Ostrom, I've hung out with their students, and I'm still constantly corrected, still constantly updated about what I'm doing right and wrong. There's an art and a craft to applying that framework that is not easily understood. ACF's a little bit like that, but not quite as deep. So I guess my point is, yeah, do it. But for some, the fit isn't as well, and for others, make sure you understand both very well. I will say with Policy Studies Journal, I can only think of one application that applied 2 theories at the same time and did it well. Actually, even got accepted. We probably get about 10 or 15 submissions where they tried to apply the same framework, or 2 frameworks in the same paper. Most of them just get rejected, and easily rejected, because you send it to a multiple streams expert, you send it to the ACF expert, and they both say they don't understand what goes on in each of these theories and frameworks. And so for PhD students, my PhD students, unless it's a very simple theory, I say do one and do it well. Do the other, do it well, and then marry them. But you got to show your kind of merit in each one independently. And once you do that, then you'll understand what's going on. That's what I would recommend. Or at very least do it with extreme caution and respect, and know that it's hard to get published in a top journal. And the reason why it's hard, by the way, too, is that the type of data you need for applying 2 different theories are different, oftentimes. ACF requires sometimes a certain type of data, or is best done with a certain type of data. Multiple streams the same way. IAD, Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, the unit of analysis is just different. And so it's hard to combine them. Anyway, he and I went more than he probably wanted to, but that's the answer that I have.
Anyone else? Okay, then to wrap up today's talk and discussions, have highlighted some of the important issues in the advocacy coalition framework. I hope the issues addressed today will be followed upon by more research efforts in the future. Well, once again, I would like to thank Dr. Weible for such an informative presentation, and I would also like to thank everyone here for coming out to join us today despite the hot weather and of course the MERS situation. Well, I hope you stay around for the rest of the conference, and I wish you all a healthy, productive summer. Thank you.
Thank you.